Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here today. The Appropriations Subcommittee on State and Local Transportation will come to order, and will the clerk please call the roll for today's attendance?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Representative Steele.
Here.
Representative Slaw.
Present.
Representative Borton.
Here.
Representative DeSena. Representative Robinson. Representative Morgan.
Here.
Representative Edwards.
Here.
Madam Chair, you have 5 of 7 members. You have a quorum.
Thank you, Clerk. Representative Borton moves to adopt the minutes of the October 22nd meeting. There being no objection, the motion prevails by unanimous consent. So, a recent Bridge Magazine article brought to light a new rail study that MDOT will be conducting. Today, we will hear from Peter Anastor and the administrator of the Office of Rails at MDOT. So, Peter, if you want to step up here and proceed with the testimony, and I appreciate you coming into our office the other day and giving us an overview, and I just thought I would like to bring it before the committee so everybody has the same information that you shared with us the other day. So, and I'll ask my questions after you present. So, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely, and thank you for inviting us in to speak to the committee. We did want to give you a little bit of an update on our passenger rail and some of the things that are going on in the Office of Rail. There's a lot of opportunity there, and it's an important mode of transportation, so something that we want to continue to look at to ways that we can make improvements. As the chairwoman said, I'm Peter Anastor. I'm the director of the Office of Rail at MDOT. I was going to start a little bit by talking about our existing passenger rail services in Michigan. We have 3 Amtrak routes that are in operation today. Those are a combined 5 round-trip trains, 7 days a week. So 10 trains essentially going eastbound, westbound, mostly to Chicago and then points in Michigan. There's a map up here. You can see those routes serve 22 station communities throughout Michigan. So both a mix of rural and urban. We do hit a lot of our university, and medical population centers. So that's something that is really of interest to us and how we can support those communities with rail. Michigan does own some Amtrak, which is a little bit unusual. Most of the passenger rail service throughout the country, and even some in Michigan, operate on host railroads. So we operate on the freight railroads, essentially. But in Michigan, Amtrak actually owns some track, which is fairly unique outside of the Northeast corridor up in New England. And then MDOT owns about 139 miles of track between Dearborn and Kalamazoo. And the purchasing of that track essentially allowed us to make investments to operate at speeds up to 110 miles per hour on that section of corridor. And then Amtrak's section is also, we're able to run at speeds of up to 110 miles per hour. Again, that's fairly unique outside the Northeast corridor. I think there's only one other line in the United States, the Chicago to St. Louis line, that runs at speeds up to 110 miles per hour. So something to be proud of here for us. We serve about 700,000 passengers per year on our existing Amtrak services. You can see from this chart, we had a dip during COVID, like a lot of transportation operators, but we've been building that service back up. We just, in fiscal year 25, which just ended on September 30th, we had about 713,000 riders on all 3 of our Amtrak services. You also see our revenue. It's the blue line, where essentially you have record revenues for our Amtrak services, which is great. In FY24, we switched to more of a revenue model that's similar to the airlines, where when there's more demand, the tickets are more expensive, less demand, less expensive tickets. And that has had a nice positive impact on the revenues that we're bringing in for our services. One of the other things that we find really important is our on-time performance. So are we getting passengers to where they want to be on the schedule that we've proposed for those routes? You can see for each one of our 3 lines, we have seen improvement in that area since FY19, which is great. The FRA, the Federal Rail Administration, has a threshold of about 80%. And as you can see, only one of our lines, the Pierre Marquette, which runs between Grand Rapids and Chicago, currently is at that threshold. But we're continuing to work with Amtrak and our host railroads to make improvements on-time performance. So that's something that we'll continue to work towards. So when we look to the future, the FRA created a new program called the Corridor Identification and Development Program. We call it Corridor ID. So that was a program that we put in applications for all 3 of our existing routes, and really to look at ways of how we can improve reliability and service on those routes. And then also looking to make improvements all the way up to adding frequencies. So we were accepted into that program for all 3 of our routes, which is fantastic. It does bring some federal money. There were 69 corridors throughout the United States that were selected for this program. That includes some existing routes. It includes some routes that are expanding, and then it includes some totally new routes between areas throughout the country. So for each one of those, for each one of our 3 existing routes, we did get an initial federal funding of about $500,000 to do the initial stage of that Corridor ID program. And it was important for us to apply for that, really to make again, to continue to make improvements on our routes. So we're really looking at providing reliable on-time performance. So are there things or investments that we can do to really improve and enhance that service at our stations, or the timelines on our routes, or maybe there's a choke point with the infrastructure that we need to address. And the idea of this Corridor ID program is to really develop that plan that looks at all of those areas and comes up with a list of recommendations or projects that will need to take place to kind of move forward to meet those goals. We also talked about increasing frequencies. So we have the 5 round-trip services. Today, we want to basically double those services. So our Pierre Marquette route, which is the one between Grand Rapids and Chicago, we have 1 round-trip service right now. We'd like to double that to 2 round-trip services. Our Blue Water route, which runs from Port Huron through East Lansing to Chicago, we have 1 round-trip route currently. We'd like to double that to at least 2 round trips. And then the Wolverine route, which runs from Oakland County, Pontiac, Royal Oak, Troy, through Detroit to Chicago. There's 3 round trips that operate every day now. We'd like to double that up to 6 round trips. And then for that service, the other unique thing we put in our application was reestablishing international service between Detroit and Windsor. Via rail, there's an existing CPKC tunnel that handles freight railroad, and that is available to be used for passenger rail service. So that's kind of considered an extension of our Wolverine, our existing Wolverine route, but that was something we included as well. So as the chairwoman mentioned, there's also been some talk about a new service for what we call the Coast to Coast, which is a service that doesn't exist today. It's something that we're looking at to look at service between Grand Rapids, Lansing, and Detroit. So more of an intrastate service for Michigan, really connecting our 2 major population centers. That study is not part of the federal Corridor ID program that FRA sponsors, that our other 3 routes have been accepted into. But it was something that was recommended by the Governor's Growing Michigan Together Council. That was occurring about the same time that we were going through the Corridor ID process with FRA. So when that recommendation came forward to really look at enhancing passenger rail service, particularly between that Grand Rapids, Lansing, Detroit corridor, there was an opportunity to kind of build on what we were already doing through this FRA Corridor ID program. And that coast to coast, it was really the genesis was Michigan Environmental Council study that was completed back in 2016 that had identified 3 potential routes for that coast to coast service. So what we did is basically, as we were looking for our 3 existing services, we ended up hiring a consultant that's going to help us take us through that corridor ID process. And as part of that consultant RFP, essentially we added this coast-to-coast project to that. So while we have that support from that consultant, again, it's not necessarily part of that federal corridor ID program. So here's a map of some of the alternative routes on that coast-to-coast corridor. I think the vision is, it would connect all the way over from Holland and Grand Rapids through Lansing and then on to Southeast Michigan. I think there's a couple alternative routes of how you would get to the Southeast Michigan portion once you arrive through Lansing. There are tracks freight tracks between Lansing and Jackson. So you could kind of take a southerly route and then connect to our existing Wolverine corridor. Or there's tracks that CSX owns between Lansing and Southeast Michigan through Howell, Ann Arbor as another option. So this study that we're embarking on will try to build on some of these alternative recommendations and really take a look at what some of those options might be. Overall, when we're talking about the future of passenger rail service, it's really looking at that connectivity and travel experience. We're really looking at how do we make improvements to really make rail a more attractive and sustainable option for residents and visitors. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the vision and a little bit about what's included in the study, as well as the FRA study. This is kind of a snapshot of all the different things going on in Michigan around passenger rail. You'll see the kind of the purple, the blue, and the red. Those are our 3 existing Amtrak services. They're numbered 1, 2, 3 here on this slide. The coast to coast is kind of the green dotted line, numbered 4 on this map. So again, that's a potential service. It doesn't exist today. We're really just embarking on the study to say, is this feasible? What's the market for something like this? What kind of investment would be needed if we were going to operate that service through Michigan? And then you'll see there's a couple other gray dotted lines. There's a couple other initiatives going on right now as well. There's a north-south service that's under study right now by a group called Groundworks, which is a Traverse City-based nonprofit. They're looking at a feasibility study of rail service between Traverse City and Ann Arbor in Southeast Michigan. They did get some federal funding for that and some state funding for that, so that's an ongoing study. And then you'll notice that if you look in Southeast, there's a dotted line between Detroit and Toledo that goes on easterly to Cleveland. That is another FRA Corridor ID route that was actually submitted by the Ohio Rail Development Commission in partnership with us that would connect basically Detroit with Cleveland and Toledo. So they are the lead on that study, but that's something, again, that doesn't exist today and is a potential route at some point in the future. So to talk a little bit about the funding for these service development plans, the step 1 of the plan is basically putting together the study. That's 100% federally funded, so that's money we got through that FRA's Corridor ID program. Step 2 of that process is really to complete the service development plan. And that part is 90% federally funded, and we have 10% state match. And then step 3 is once you identify the projects, the infrastructure projects that need to occur under that plan, step 3 has funding available from the feds to complete the preliminary engineering and the NEPA environmental activities. So that is 80% federally funded, and we would have to come up with 20% match for any project that we wanted to put through that. The coast-to-coast study is, again, since it's not part of that FRA program, we do not get federal dollars for that. That's being funded through state appropriations. There was a one-time appropriation in FY24 for intermodal capital investment grants, and that's the funding source that we are using to basically fund that coast-to-coast study. So no new money is needed or will be used. That's money that was appropriated back in FY24. And then at the end of that process, when you get to actual projects that are needed, maybe you need to invest in some additional rail or something like that, then being in this corridor ID program gives us preference for other federal grant programs that are already existing out there. So once we get to final design and construction, we'll have to compete for competitive grant funding at the federal level, but being in this program gives us a leg up compared to routes that aren't in the corridor ID program. So again, this is just a visual of that 3-step process for the corridor ID. Step 1 is really the scoping and program initiation. Step 2 is that service development plan creation. And then step 3 is kind of the first step in project development around that PE, preliminary engineering and environmental NEPA clearance. And then you can see the future phases, that's when you do final design construction. Timelines, we're kind of really in the orange box in the early engagement on all of these studies. And basically in step 2, we're gonna look to begin that in early next year. We are close to being completed with step 1 for the 3 corridor IDs and the coast to coast. So those are basically the ones that need to be reviewed by FRA are being reviewed by them. They're having some resource changes at the federal level, so that could take a little longer than maybe previously anticipated. But we think by early next year, we'll be well underway in moving towards the actual work in our service development plans. Again, step 1, we're nearing completion of this now. It's really developing the scope and schedule of that service development plan. Step 2 is looking at that service development plan planning. We expect to start that in spring of next year and really have most of the heavy lifting done in the next 18 to 24 months, although all elements of that are probably gonna drag on a couple years past that. The coast-to-coast plan is expected to be completed in 2028 as well. That will involve engaging with stakeholders, really looking at the infrastructure that exists. When you take an existing freight line and you want to upgrade it to passenger rail, there is quite a bit of new investment that's going to be required on that route. The biggest being positive train control, which is a FRA requirement for any passenger rail served route in the United States. Freights aren't required to have that positive train control. So anytime we're trying to engage new service on a freight route, that'll be part of that investment equation on the front end. And then we have started some initial stakeholder coordination, really with talking with some of the communities that would be served. We've had a lot of meetings with the freight railroads. Obviously, both freight and passenger railroads are a big priority for us in Michigan. So we want to make sure that all of our freight partners, be it a Class 1 or a short line railroad here in Michigan, are understanding what's going on and how they may be involved in this. And we want to make sure that they have opportunities to offer their input as well. We're also, meeting with some of our stakeholder groups like a Michigan Association of Rail Passengers and other stakeholder groups that have an interest in rail. And those conversations will just get more robust as we move further into this process. We do have a website. If you go to michigan.gov/Michigan Passenger Rail Future, that's where we plan to keep providing updates for all 4 of these potential plans and routes and information that's going on. There's also, I think, a way to sign up for a newsletter. So if you want to have information pushed to you, you can put in your email and we'll share any updates that are going on. Also, if people have comments, they can go to the site that's live now. People can provide their input and comments on some of the plans and what's going on with passenger rail service in the U.S. So that's a snapshot. I know that was a lot. It was probably a little bit confusing because it did get into the details a little bit. I think the biggest takeaways is that we're looking for ways to continue to improve rail in Michigan. We're looking at this coast to coast is really at the initial phases of trying to understand what it would mean and what it would take to actually bring that service into reality, what the market is for that sort of service, what type of investment and equipment would we need to support that service. So I'm happy to answer any questions and clarify any of the comments I made from the committee.
Of course, I have 5 questions first. Thank you. I appreciate your coming here today and just enlightening us on this. So just to clarify, you received a grant to do a study on the 3 existing routes, and while you had the consultant available, you're doing the study on the coast to coast as a feasibility study to see if we can add a 4th line.
Yes. So
Yes.
that we did not apply for that coast to coast when we applied for the 3 existing routes. But since there's a lot of similarity in those activities, we wanted to take that opportunity to move that forward too.
And then you had mentioned that there was a study done on basically how to move Michigan forward, and it was the results of that study that made us do this study. Wasn't there another study that was done a handful of years ago saying that we might need a 4th line? So I guess my question is, how many studies that we have to say that this is something that we should study more?
For the coast to coast, the biggest study was really this Michigan Environmental Council from 2016. And that's the baseline that we're going to build from when we're looking at that coast to coast study. There's been other studies in Michigan that have looked at routes in southeast Michigan. There's been commuter rail studies. There's also existing service development plans for our 3 existing Amtrak routes, at least on the Wolverine service. And then Michigan's also part of some studies that have happened that have looked at Midwest rail. So there's also 2 or 3 studies out there that have looked at Midwest. But when you're looking at that coast to coast, really the baseline is that Michigan Environmental Council study that was done in 2016.
So we don't have an actual study of how much it costs to do that, just studies saying that we should study it. I know, I don't mean to be facetious, but I'm actually wondering, we don't have anything, because I was looking for reports to actually review prior to this meeting to see if there was some information of previous studies to say, okay, we really do need a 4th line or we don't need a 4th line.
Typically how these things work is that initial study will be very visionary and, tip your toe in the water, put the vision out there and see what kind of reaction you get. The studies that we're doing here are going to be, I'll say, a little more quantitative in that they're going to say, the vision's great, but what is it actually going to take to make some of these things happen so that those decisions can be made? So these will look more at truly like what kind of investment is going to be needed to make these expansions or to create a new coast-to-coast service. And the service development plan, it's a very prescriptive FRA requirement. So There's really specific things you have to do around market studies and, investments and things like that. So that it's going to be much more of, I'll say, a hard scale study than anything that's kind of been done previously.
And then if I could get a copy of that 2016, if you have it, I mean, if you could send us that link.
Yeah, we could email it
We do
over.
have it, we do. Okay, we just did, apparently we have it, so I just need to review it, so sorry about that. And then I have a couple questions, but I'm gonna pass it to the other representatives and then come back. So first, Rep. Slaw.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I've got a couple questions. I don't know if you want, Madam Chair. I got a couple questions. Would you like me to do that? Multiple? Okay, perfect. So thanks for being here. Appreciate that. I'm in your materials that you gave to us on page 3. It's the ridership and revenue graph that you have.
Yes.
And interestingly, your revenue has consistently since 16 tracked below your ridership from a growth perspective, right? And all of a sudden you're over top of that. How is that? Revenue seems to be going up faster than your ridership.
Yeah, so that was we made a change in FY24 around how we managed revenue and ticket sales. So previously in the past, we had more of a static fare to ride our services. And in FY24, we made that much more dynamic based on ridership demand. So that allowed us, when we had heavy ridership, that we could increase those ticket prices. And then when we had less ridership, we could lower those ticket prices in order to enhance, entice more riders to get on the train. So that difference really allowed us to grow revenues faster than just the number of tickets we were selling.
Okay, thank you. On page 4 of the materials that you handed out, it shows the on-time performance. And just, can you give me some reasons why you don't think we're able to meet that 80% threshold?
Yeah, there's a myriad of reasons. So a couple of things that have been happening recently. One is literally construction. So much like the same on the highways, we have a rail construction season in Michigan that happens, and if we're doing track work or something adjacent to the track, then those trains can't operate at their normal speeds. They have to slow down. Instead of operating at maybe 79 or that 110, they may have to go through those construction areas at 25 miles per hour or something like that. So we've had quite a bit of major construction projects on our Amtrak services, so that's been a piece of it. We're also, we have new equipment in Michigan, both our locomotives and our passenger cars, and Amtrak is our servicer of that equipment. And we haven't had the availability as much as we need, and the equipment has had a few kind of mechanical issues that they've been working through. So that sometimes delays trains as well. If they're trying to work on an issue with equipment. So those are two of the bigger ones. And then there could also be freight train interference. So we share tracks with the freight industry. If we get behind a freight train, that could slow us down on our schedule. We could even have passenger train interference. So, as we go in and out of Chicago, there's other routes as well, not just Michigan's routes that are using those tracks. We might have to wait for other passenger rail service. And then the other biggest one typically is related to that positive train control. So that's the signaling between the train and the infrastructure. And with all technology, sometimes there's a hiccup in that technology. So we have to operate at a little bit slower speeds when those incidents occur. So those are probably the biggest reasons of some of that delay.
And one of my questions was positive train control, because I really didn't know what that was. So what you're telling me is that's the technology that allows you to maximize when trains can be on the track, where they're going to be at, how are we going to stop and start a freight train versus the Amtrak coming through? That
Yeah,
kind of thing?
so the PTC basically overrides the locomotive engineer. So if there's a curve that's supposed to be taken at 65 miles per hour, if that train is traveling faster than that, then that positive train control will kick in and take control of that train essentially, or provide alerts and that sort of thing. So it's a FRA requirement on all our passenger rail routes in the U.S.
And then my last question is just, can you go back over the number of miles of track owned?
Yeah, so for the passenger rail, we own 139 miles of track. We also own freight track, so in total, we own 665 miles of track in Michigan, but a vast majority of that's on our freight railroads.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Rep.
And that's
Borton.
out of, there's about 3,300 miles of track throughout all of Michigan, so the even larger majority is owned by the private railroads.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Peter, thank you very much for your presentation today. My question is, who owns the Holland to Detroit line?
So CSX Railroad owns that infrastructure.
Are they supportive of adding passenger service on that line?
We haven't had in-depth conversations, but in our preliminary conversations, they've understand our goals and I think are willing to work with us.
Okay, that partially answers my last question was, are they going to be involved in this study?
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely.
All right,
We're
thank-
going to involve all of our freight rails because we don't want to do anything. It's not a zero-sum game for us, so we don't want to gain passenger service by losing freight service. We need to make sure whatever investments we're doing can support freight and passenger rail.
Okay, thank you.
Rep. Morgan.
Thank you, Chair. I'm very excited to hear more about passenger rail here. I think this is really exciting. I think there are a lot of great opportunities ahead of us in this area. I am a couple of questions. One, really looking at particularly page 6 of your presentation around enhancing existing services. What are the barriers to, I mean, I think as the chair was kind of asking about, we've done a lot of studies on rail in Michigan. I've been on several of those committees. I've read as many of those as I can, but what does it take to actually make these things happen, start making them happen, and which ones are most viable? It seems like increasing frequencies on our existing routes is probably the most viable, but I'm curious, how do we move beyond studies to implementation and seeing increased frequencies and more routes being built up, and what do we need to do on our end?
Yes, and I would agree that expanding existing routes where investments already been made and passenger service is already operating is a much easier path than creating new service. I think there's two things that really are gonna have the biggest impact on how and when we can expand that service. One is equipment. So if you're gonna have more trains and more riders, you're gonna need more equipment. And there's not an overabundance of equipment right now in the national rail network. In fact, there's probably a lack to meet the needs that are out there right now. So any new expansion is going to need new equipment. Equipment is expensive, and there's a long lead time to buy locomotives and rail cars. I think it's probably about 5 years right now from when you could place an order to when you actually may get that equipment being delivered. So that's one of the biggest hurdles, is making all that kind of come together at the right time. The second piece is just rail capacity, so the infrastructure. In Michigan, it's interesting because the biggest capacity constraint we have on our rail infrastructure is when we have to go through Indiana and Illinois around Lake Michigan and into Chicago Union Station. So when we operate on that portion of our route, we operate on Norfolk Southern-owned rail, and that is literally their superhighway of rail. I think there's 110 trains a day that pass through that rail. And it's double tracked, and there's a few bridges in that due to the age of those bridges, even though they're double tracked, there can only be one train at a time that passes through those bridges. So really to further enhance that capacity, there's going to need to be some investment made, particularly looking at that south of the lake segment. So we are working with the Federal Rail Administration and Amtrak and other state partners through really this corridor ID process to determine, again, what types of investments are going to be needed. But that's probably the other big piece is how do we ensure that we have that infrastructure in place that is going to allow us to have all those trains moving.
But if we wanted to, one of your things listed is double the frequencies on Wolverine or to 2 for Blue Water or Pere Marquette. Could we just do those tomorrow if we had the financial resources for it? Or, how do we make those happen?
Yeah, you could, I think if you could, I mean, anything you do where you use a freight route, you need to get their approval to do that. So it's not like we could just tell NS, hey, we're going to start running more trains on your tracks. There has to be an agreement put in place. But if you looked at intrastate, so let's say we're just going to run between Kalamazoo and Ann Arbor on tracks we own, really that biggest hurdle is equipment, of having the equipment essentially to do that.
Okay. Can I just ask one more, Chair? Okay. One last question here then is, would we be able to, are there some of these route options that would allow us to pull in more federal funds or federal resources, whether it's connecting through Toledo through that corridor ID or connecting internationally? Are there routes that we could secure more federal support for rail in Michigan? And what does that cost look like either way? Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, I think there's federal opportunities for all of these routes. We've been fairly successful in getting federal grants for our infrastructure and investments we want to make in Michigan. There's an opportunity right now of the feds have a NOFO out that we're looking at and considering, I think, 3 to 4 projects for that funding. So we always want to take advantage of that federal funding, and I don't know that it's determinate by route. It's just kind of more project determinate. What's infrastructure's needed? What are you applying for? One thing to note about federal grants is that rail, unlike other modes of transportation, does not get any formula funding from the feds. Like any rail funding we get is through strictly competitive grant rounds. Which obviously makes things a little difficult because you're not sure if you're going to get funded or not, and when those dollars are going to show up. So we definitely, I think there's going to be opportunities for more federal funding to help us with some of these visions and goals, and we're certainly going to take advantage of as many of those opportunities as we can.
Thank you. And just to piggyback on Rep. Morgan is that enhancing existing services is a vision, but you're actually doing this study to see how to implement that vision, like increasing the round trips to Wolverine and how much it would cost to do that and how many more rails that we need and how many more cars we need. Very specific answers to how to increase if we choose to increase. That's what this study will be accomplishing.
Yes.
Okay.
There'll be a specific list of projects that says if you want to go from 3 to 6, these are the things that are going to have to be completed, and ideally we'll have some price tags with some of that stuff too.
Okay. And you don't have a piggy bank there for all this stuff as of right?
No, and again, that's where I think we would say, hey, let's apply this one for a federal grant, right, and see if we can tick that off. Some may be small investments that may not be infrastructure driven. Maybe there are things we can do at the stations that make things more efficient. And maybe we can use just some of our existing resources to do those things.
Low-hanging fruit, and then start picking off the big ones if it's feasible.
Yeah.
Okay, so I appreciate that. So I have 2 quick questions, and is on page 11, there's 3 other lines in the gray that are being studied again, and they're not a part of this study. Are they with the same consultant that's doing our study to say, okay, we're doing this as a group project, or are we doing individual projects in silos?
Yeah, so the north-south is a different consultant. But what, with our involvement in these, there's going to be a recognition that what happens there is going to impact, what we're trying to do and vice versa. So there'll be a lot of, coordination there. And the consultant that's doing that north-south study is very familiar with Michigan. They work with us on other projects, just not specifically on that north-south. The gray line between Detroit and Ohio, that one, Ohio has not selected a consultant for that yet. But the reality is it's a pretty small world in the rail consulting business. And the consultants that operate here in the Midwest, it's likely that whoever they hire is going to have some familiarity with the Midwest and Michigan and what's going on. And then the service development plan process will really help to ensure that some of that coordination is happening. So I think, while there's different pieces going on, that holistic view is something that we can accomplish and make sure we're not tripping over each other or working in conflict with each other.
Yeah, good, thank you. And then you had mentioned something when you came into our office the other day, that we always think passenger train, we always think Amtrak. And that, we do have, they are our service provider with the cars, but you had mentioned that there's other providers that might be able to have the boxcars, or not, what are they, the train that they could provide for us. So can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, so, Amtrak's definitely the dominant passenger rail operator throughout the United States, but that's changing a little bit. There are some new services down in Florida by a company called Brightline. So that's a private company that essentially is operating passenger rail service in Florida. They're also looking at now service in California, Nevada. That's a separate operator. And then even here in the Midwest, Illinois is looking at a new route where they have selected Metra, which is the commuter rail operator in Chicago, to really look at some of their inner city passenger rail service. It could be that those providers do have equipment, but it's probably more likely that, well, they would happy to be your operator. You would still have to invest in new equipment within that partnership to get them. I don't think Brightline's sitting on a whole lot of extra equipment, and Metro maybe, but it may be more commuter rail type of seating and equipment than, inner city passenger.
We'll have to buy New York's leftovers. I don't have any other questions. Any other questions? Okay. I'll allow you one more, Rep. Morgan.
One more I had here was, one more was looking at how much do we spend on passenger rail operations currently in Michigan? I know there's some metric of we pay the difference, I think, between what we bring in revenue and what it actually costs us. So I'm curious, what do we spend currently, and is there kind of an estimate of a dollar amount per route? So thinking through, like, if we wanted one more route on Pure Marquette, how much does that ballpark look like?
Yeah, so in total, we spend about $25 million per year to support our Amtrak services. So again, that's the nexus between all the expenses and then the ticket revenues that we receive, or Amtrak receives. The routes, obviously there's a little bit of economies of scale that the more frequencies you have, the, you know, operational cost per seat, if you want to call it that, is less because there's some fixed costs that are built in. So if we double service on the Blue Water Pierre Marquette, it doesn't necessarily mean we're going to be doubling our costs per se. So each route is individual. It's hard to just say, hey, if we spend another $1 million, we're going to get X result. You kind of have to build it in these stair steps, right? I don't have a good number just, you know, in that kind of context, but with the investments we already made and with some of the operations we have existing, there should be some things that we can build on to really help hold some of those additional costs down as we add future operations.
Okay, with no further business at hand, I would like to adjourn the meeting. I don't want to.